about history and what it means to us and how it affects our lives today. Thank you for this fellowship, and just thank you for the connections that we've made already today, just helping each other and sharing our needs and meeting our needs with each other. What a great fellowship, a great community we have here, and I just thank you for that. So thank you for our time together today, and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, so pop quiz. Who remembers the Merovingians? Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah. Yeah. What did we talk? What did we talk about last week? Do you remember? Do you remember this guy?
The short.
The short. Pepin the short. So what do we remember about Pepin the short? Yeah, the steward. I can't remember the title, but mayor of the palace, right? Okay, and what did he do? Why was he mayor of the palace? He was mayor of the palace because all the Merovingian kings were pre-adolescent, and so they had no authority as king. In other words, he was doing all the work, but he had no title. The kids had the title, but had no authority to do the work. So, what did Pepin do?
Petition to become the king.
To whom? The Pope. Pope Zachary specifically. He went to Zachary and said, is it right for someone to hold the title and have no authority, and then for somebody to have all the authority but not have the title? The Pope agreed with him and said, that's right. So this initiated a bloodless coup where Pepin showed up at dinner that night and said, hey, kids, yeah, go to the kids' table. So the reason I wanted to start there is, what does that tell you about the papacy, about the Pope? Power. Who is really in charge here? The Pope had the final say. He had to go and get the blessing from the Pope in order to make this happen. So our first, and that's, I think, illustrating kind of the rise of the papacy, the power and the authority of the papacy. This is a list of all of the popes in the High Middle Ages, and we're going to spend about 15 minutes on each one of them. No, we're really not. So,
my eye is immediately drawn to Leo the Ninth, Stephen the Ninth, and then John the 21st. Mm-hmm. The Roman numerals are crazy.
Yeah, but so many are short. Okay, so this is a period of about a little over 200 years. There's 42, I think, listed here. So their terms in office were their terms were relatively short, about 5 or 6 years on average. Not like today, our popes we're used to them serving for 20 years or more. But I want to focus on, there's several that we could talk about that are pretty interesting, but I'm going to focus on about 3 or 4 here. I'm going to start with Leo. Leo, mainly because he's the first in the Middle Ages. He's kind of a transitionary pope. He didn't do a whole lot, but I just wanted to, he's got some interesting things here. Gregory the Seventh is very instrumental, very influential in this time period. If you talk about the High Middle Ages, probably the 2 most common popes, or the most common names you hear, would be Urban II and Innocent III. They were arguably the most influential during this time period. So those are the ones that I want to focus on. There's some other really interesting ones that if you want to go and do some reading, some fascinating history in this time period. Winnie can tell you that once I start reading and preparing for a lesson, I spend about this much time preparing for the lesson, about this much time just chasing rabbits and just reading other things. And I've learned just, there's a lot of really fascinating history here. So I would encourage you, if you're interested, to go and do some additional reading. So some things I want to point out here about some of these popes in particular. Leo the First, or not Leo the First, Leo the Ninth. He's called the traveling pope, or I'm calling him the traveling pope. He was kind of a missionary pope, and he was also a like a transition into the High Middle Ages. What he is known for is he went around Europe and traveled throughout the region. He extended the papacy from a Roman institution to truly an international, worldwide institution. That was his main achievement. Along the way, he was really trying to unify the church and to bring people together. He got along well with Constantinople, who was in the Eastern church. What do you remember happened? Um, the schism, the rift happened that Thomas talked about last week. So he was trying to bring the sides together. It hadn't happened quite yet, but he was really trying to unify the church. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. The church split, and he died about within a year after the Great Schism. Yeah.
So the Great Schism, it hadn't happened, and he was trying to fix it again. He was trying to prevent it.
He was trying to prevent it. He was trying to unify, trying to bring people together, and he was fairly successful in many respects. People loved him, people liked him, but the issues, the differences were just too strong. He couldn't overcome them, and the schism happened. I can't remember what year that was, but shortly after he died. So the next one I want to talk about is Gregory the Seventh. Gregory the Seventh carried on from the tradition of Gregory the Great. Gregory the Great, what do we remember about him? We talked about last week. What was his main contribution to the church?
The seven.
Well, seven deadly sins. He came up with that, but he was structured the church in a way that he built a foundation for continuous growth for the church. And Gregory the Seventh tried to build on that. He was not a popular pope, but he wielded a lot of authority. Called him the excommunicator. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but Gregory the Seventh had a contentious relationship with European leaders, particularly Henry the Fourth. He was both King of Germany and the Holy Roman Emperor. Gregory the Seventh excommunicated Henry 3 times. Henry the Fourth, responded by appointing Clement the Third as an anti-pope to oppose Gregory. Pardon?
It's just such a funny term. We call him the anti-pope.
Well, yeah, he put him. So basically, what Henry said is, okay, you're going to excommunicate me. I'm going to effectively excommunicate you. I'm now in charge, and I'm going to appoint my own pope over here, Clement the Third. Well, Gregory then appealed to Robert Guiscard. I'm not sure, but he was the ruler of Sicily, and appealed to him for help. And they came and sacked Rome in 1084 and ended Clement's tenure as pope. And then Henry IV retreated and basically capitulated. Although he restored the papacy and the integrity of the papacy, he was an unpopular pope, and he died very, very unpopular. But he wielded a lot of authority, and his main contribution is he increased or consolidated power of the papacy. Yes, Beth.
Which country was Henry IV from?
Henry IV was actually in Germany. You said England. He was actually in Germany, and he was a Holy Roman Emperor. Yeah.
And how were these popes chosen?
Which Pope? Clement? It's good. I'm not sure how they're actually chosen. I assume it was like a council of cardinals like it is, but I don't know how that's changed, or if it has. Well, I'm not sure he was unpopular when he started, but he became very unpopular. Yeah, and during his tenure. So, um, so then we go to Urban. Urban, we labeled him the Crusader. So who knows what Urban is famous for? Crusades. He called the First Crusade. So he was responsible for changing the course of European history forever by calling the First Crusade. Um, in March 1095, and we'll talk a little bit more about the history here, but the Byzantine Emperor Alexios called for help from the European brethren to respond to the Seljuk Turk Muslim raids in Christian Byzantine lands. And Urban called on the Council of Claremont, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit. Um, but he went to this Council of Claremont and he urged followers to fight for the holy cause. And he made a lot of promises, which we'll talk about. But he called on the First Crusade. Now, the First Crusade actually ended up being fairly successful as far as meeting its objectives. It's probably the only one that actually had any success. There was 7 crusades in total. This one, there's another one that had marginal success, but the First Crusade was the only one that really succeeded in retaking Jerusalem. And again, we'll talk more about the Crusades here in a little bit. The last one that we have here is Innocent III. Innocent inherited the seat that was deemed the most powerful in Europe at the time, making him, when he became Pope, the most powerful man in Europe. Innocent III held an exalted view of his office and sought to expand its reach and authority. So he was all about increasing the power and control of the papacy. He made liberal use of interdict, which is, we'll talk more about that here in just a little bit, but called him the interdictor. This is basically telling a country that you can no longer, the church can no longer operate in your country. So he removed the authority from the on several occasions. In fact, he imposed interdict around 80 some odd times during his tenure. Unlike earlier popes, who were typically monks who trained as theologians, as pastoral type leaders, Innocent was trained as a canon lawyer. He was an expert in church governance. He was all about the law and the governance, the administration. Very different background from the previous popes. He was also gripped by crusade fever. He called the Fourth Crusade. Now, we skipped a couple of crusades, but we'll talk about those. But he led the Fourth Crusade, which ended up being a complete disaster. So he was also renowned for his conflicts with kings. He had, as I said, he had a very exalted view of the office, and the conflicts with the kings arose really from this exalted view. He promoted this idea of the sun and the moon allegory. And I'll show you here this is actually a quote from him. This is a letter reaffirming his position or his view of his office. He says, I can't read my notes over here. Just as God, founder of the universe, has constituted 2 large luminaries in the firmament of heaven, a major one to dominate the day and a minor one to dominate the night, so he has established the firmament of the universal church, which is signified by the name of heaven, 2 great dignitaries, a major one to preside, so to speak, over the days of the souls, and a minor one to preside over the nights of the bodies. So the major one is to preside over the spiritual affairs, and the lower one over the physical affairs. They are the pontifical authority and the royal power. So he's seeing a distinction between the pontificate and the royal powers. Basically, he's saying that the only light that the rulers and the kings have is what is reflected from the Pope. The Pope is the light that provides it's reflected by the kings. So the kings really didn't like that definition or that description, and he had this contentious relationship with them throughout his papacy. But one of the things that he was successful in was greatly expanding the reach and the authority of the church. So we talked a little bit about how do they increase their authority? How did they control the masses, so to speak? Well, there's two penalties that they used extensively. One is called excommunication, which is individual separation from the church. The Pope could pronounce the person's anathema or curse, and they would be set apart or banned from the church, deprived of the grace essential for salvation. So if you're not part of the church, you can't, you've grown up. The only way to get grace and get salvation is through the church. So if you can't be part of the church, this is a big deal. So you don't want to be excommunicated. Well, under excommunication, persons could not act as judge, juror, witness, or attorney. They could not be guardians, executors, or parties to any contract. After death, they received no Christian burial, and if by chance they were buried in a consecrated ground, the church would have their bodies disinterred and destroyed. So excommunication was a big deal, and it was a penalty that was held out over people to keep them in line, basically. The other penalty was interdict. While excommunication was aimed at individuals, the interdict fell upon whole nations. It would suspend all public worship, and with the exception of baptism and extreme unction, it withdrew the sacraments from the lands of disobedient rulers. So it was really aimed at the rulers, but the people were the byproducts. They suffered the penalties of that along with the ruler. But it was a way for the Pope to keep the rulers in line with him. So a few examples here of how this played out. These are some people who went crossways with the Pope. So we'll talk about King John of England first. And these are all, I think these are all Innocent III. I think these are all Innocent III. But John, King of England, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury died in 1205. King John wanted to appoint a certain person, John Gray, who is a bishop of Norwich, to be the replacement for the archbishop. So here again, historically, these appointments, there was a little bit nebulous. In some places, the kings would appoint the archbishops. In some places, the Pope would directly appoint the archbishop. In some places, the councils would appoint the archbishops. But what Innocent and the popes in this era did is they consolidated the power where everything now goes through Rome. What they wanted to do was have absolute loyalty and fealty to the Pope across all of the offices in Europe. So the cathedral chapter, which is the Council of Clerics, they wanted to appoint a different person, and the bishops, they also claimed authority to appoint the archbishop, and the Pope, Innocent, ignored all of them and appointed somebody completely different. One of his supporters, probably just to spite them. Well, King John didn't like this because he thought that Innocent was usurping his authority, and he refused to allow Langton, who was the Innocent's appointment, he refused to allow him to enter the country. He said, great, but you can't come in the country, and I'm going to take all of your land, I'm going to take all of your possessions, and things like that. John, make a long story short, John finally negotiated a settlement and surrendered in May 1213, and when he did, he actually surrendered the kingdom of England to the Pope, and became a vassal state. So that's how much power the Pope had to control, the kings and so forth. Philip Augustus, he was king of France, also known as Philip II. So his wife Isabella dies in childbirth in 1190. He decides to marry Ingeborg, who is, hey, it's a name. He wants to marry Ingeborg, who is the daughter of the king of Denmark. Now, this is interesting. They were married on the same day they met. So I don't know if he decided to marry her and then went and found her and met her or what. But they married on the same day they met. Well, after the wedding ceremony, they were having the feast, and he was all of a sudden having second thoughts. So the following day, Philip sent Ingeborg to a convent and requested an annulment from Pope Celestine on grounds of non-consummation of the marriage. But Ingeborg wouldn't have any of that. She wanted to consummate the marriage and become queen. So, but Philip decided anyway he was going to seek out a new wife, and he married Agnes in 1196. When he married Agnes in 1196, Innocent III declared the marriage of Agnes was null and void. She's not your wife, and she was still, because he was still married to Ingeborg. Philip refused, and Innocent issued an interdict in France, basically saying the church can no longer operate in France because the king is out of control. Under pressure from the Pope and also the King of Denmark, Philip eventually acquiesced and took Ingeborg as his wife. It didn't hurt, I will say, that Agnes happened to die in the meantime, but he did eventually take Ingeborg as his wife. So, pardon? So the last one here is Otto IV. He was crowned emperor by Innocent in 1209, but somebody else, another guy named Frederick, had challenged him, and later Otto, because he wanted to get even with Frederick, he invaded Italy, and that angered Innocent III. In response, he turned his support to Frederick. And also Frederick promised to respect papal rights and go on crusades, etc. Innocent excommunicated Otto, which diminished his authority. It didn't completely, he didn't lose his crown, but it greatly diminished his authority, and he was never the same. He eventually was replaced by Frederick as the new emperor. So the Pope wielded a lot of power over political leaders, kings of Europe. So that's really what I wanted you to see here. How are we doing on time? I got to pick up the pace here.
Did you read about Otto?
I did.
You studied his biography?
What about him?
Is it an autobiography?
That was really well set up. I was like, where's she going? And then I started thinking about his name. I'm like,
All right. So, so another thing I wanted to point out, just kind of revisiting, last week Thomas went through a little bit of this. He talked about some of the construction and some of the churches. One of the things he talked about was how do you recognize a Roman cathedral? You remember what he said? Arches, but not just an arch, but what about the arch? It's a perfect circle. It's right. It's rounded, perfectly it's a semicircle. So we're going to see a little bit of a change in that in this time period. So we're going to start with the Basilica of Saint Denis. In 1144, they rebuilt the abbey and extended the height to about 80 feet. And this is the first appearance of Gothic architecture was in the Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris. I need to read. This is just the abbey. Well, I'll let you read that. I'll pause for just a minute. the whole idea of this Gothic architecture is it allowed them to have large windows, whereas the Roman architecture, the windows were typically at the very top of the cathedral, and the light really didn't come into the lower portions of the building as well as they did with this new design. And that was very important because the idea of light, God's light coming into the buildings was very significant to them.
Because of light buttresses, though.
Yes,
They were
exactly.
That support structure on the outside instead of the inside.
Yeah.
No joke, just saying.
Yeah, well, the buttresses allowed them to support the walls, and the walls became much thinner, which meant they could then put larger panes of glass and just all of this kind of stuff.
When you walked in, it was
Exactly. That was the other thing, is it was designed to lift your head and raise your head. So over the course of the next few years, there was, I can't remember I lost the numbers here. There was, I think, 200 or 300 cathedrals built, primarily in 500 churches were built in the Gothic style in France alone over the next 100 years. So this is just showing you how they evolved, some of the different churches in the area. So I put this picture on here. Just look at the massive size that compared to the surrounding terrain. And then Beauvais Cathedral, when this one was built, it was taller than the pyramids. It was, at the time it was built, the tallest human structure in the world. So it was the growth and the height and the building boom was tremendous, and this was all reflective of the papacy and its power and authority.
And the amount of money that they had.
Exactly.
Around in there.
Yep. Yeah.
They were going door to door to people going,
So I pulled this slide in again from Thomas's notes last week. These are some different cathedrals than what I highlighted, but you can see the gradual rise and kind of the construction there of the churches. So the Gothic architecture was deeply symbolic. Height and light were meant to draw the soul upward and to draw them to God. Influential thinkers like Abbot Suger is spelled like sugar, promoted the idea that beauty, light, and verticality reflected divine glory. Taller cathedrals weren't just impressive, they were acts of worship in stone, according to the builders. Yeah.
It sounds like some of this is also a bit of competition from one to the next.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure they were competing with one another. Yeah, they were, in fact, each builder was, just like we do today. You wait until, somebody finishes the previous one, then you make yours just a little bit taller. And one of the jokes that I read is, if you ever go on a tour, ask them what year did it collapse, because they all ended up collapsing at some point. Different aspects, because the structures they built so high up, and they were so overconfident in many respects of their building materials and building structure that they really couldn't sustain themselves. And this Beauvais, the last one we looked at, was kind of the limit. That's where it stopped. They couldn't go any higher. After that, they started representing height with spires. Again, they started going much higher with spires and steeples and things like that. Yeah. Well, not just 100% collapse, but a lot of the choirs, they would fall in. They'd have to rebuild them, things like that, and they'd have to reinforce things. So it was, they're. Some of them were not, as they got taller and taller, they were not as structurally sound.
Some of them were.
Yeah, I won't mention the timing of that, Emma, but, it's like, who was the last person we saw leaving that building, yeah. So. Okay.
Some people probably don't know that story, but
Okay. So the year that the Notre Dame Cathedral burned, Emma was living in Paris. Emma Campbell, Thomas's daughter, she was living in Paris at the time, and she had just toured the cathedral like an hour before it burned, before it caught fire. So we were joking. What did you do, Emma? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Crusades. Okay, this is fun stuff. So this is the timeline. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, just in the interest of time. I'm going to keep moving. All right. So this is a slide. This map is one that Thomas had. I liked his better. I had one, but his actually is a little bit better slide, I think. So Thomas talked a little bit about the birth of Islam last week. Islam started down here around Mecca and Medina. Muhammad was from Mecca, and he started his movement there, but they kind of ran him out of town. He went to Medina and established his following there, and then later moved back in on and conquered Mecca, and then ended up conquering larger amounts of territory. He didn't leave a designated successor, which created some confusion and some dissension among his followers. I'm not going to go into all the detail, but each of these caliphates arose from some different disputes. I will say that each of these guys did not die natural causes. Let's just say that. So Abu Bakr, who is one of his followers, expanded Muslim, expanded the caliphate through most of the Arabian Peninsula. And then we had the Rashidun Caliphate, expanded all the way out here to northern Africa. The Umayyad Caliphate ended up coming all the way over here into modern-day Spain. And then these 3 or 4 guys, these were immediate followers of Muhammad, part of his inner circle, and they battled for position and control afterward. But the main thing that you want to see is how quickly it expanded and controlled most of, really all of the southern Mediterranean. What you'll also notice is that they tried to make inroads into the Byzantine Empire. They tried to make inroads over here on this side. The Franks were able to keep them back, and the Byzantines were also able to push back on the Muslims for a period of time. But so that brings us to the Abbasid Caliphate, which is this dark line, which the next slide we want to come to is talking about the Seljuks. The Seljuks, Seljuk is actually a person's name, and he was part of the Oghuz Turks, and who originated up in the Aral Sea, and he traveled to a town or a place called Jind, or took an army, took a group down there. But at Jind, he converted to Islam in 985. Well, that was the extent of Seljuk's travels, but his kids kept taking the movement farther, and they traveled down to Persia. Musa was Seljuk's son, and he led and this was not a conquering force necessarily, but they came down and they actually lived among the Persians, and from I'm not sure exactly where the transition happened, but initially they kind of got along with each other. But at some point, they were asked by the, if you come back over here to the Abbasid Caliphate had been weakened, and they needed help in Baghdad. They were battling for control of Baghdad, so they requested the Seljuks to come and help them control Baghdad. So they went over and they conquered Baghdad. They removed the Buyid dynasty, at the request of the Abbasid Caliphate. And at that point, the Seljuks pretty much were in control of this area. They then moved to the battle to Manzikert, which was the first major defeat for the Byzantines. And then from Manzikert, they came down to Jerusalem. They conquered Jerusalem in 1073, and then they started moving into Asia Minor. So if you're looking at this map, if you're a pope or if you're a leader in Rome or the Byzantine area, what are you thinking? Yeah, they're coming for us. This is imminent. We've got to protect ourselves. The other thing to think about here is for years, Jerusalem was a pilgrimage destination. Christians would come from all over Europe and they would come down to Jerusalem in annual or semi-annual pilgrimages. And for the most part, the Abbasid caliphates and the other previous caliphates were mostly tolerant to the Christians coming through. There may have been a few rough shoulders here or there, but mostly they were, okay, we'll let you come in, we'll give you free passage. I think mostly they were interested in the commerce, and so they got along that way. But the Seljuks said, no, we're not going to allow that anymore. So they shut down the traffic going into Jerusalem, basically shut it off from the Christians. So that was another concern that people in Europe had. They had no more access to Jerusalem. So then along comes, there's just a picture of the Battle of Manzikert. Okay, so then along comes Innocent III. Innocent III, or Urban II, I'm sorry. Urban II convened the Council of Clermont in 1095 in response to everything he's seeing here on the landscape. He's saying, okay, how do we combat this? We need to have access to Jerusalem. And that was the premise of the First Crusade, is we need to free Jerusalem. So he called for the First Crusade to recapture the Holy Land. And during his speech, he made a lot of promises to people, like if you would follow us in this crusade, all your sins would be forgiven. Things like that. So this was very popular, or very resonated with a lot of people. He urged Christians to fight for a spiritual cause, and he ended with an impassioned plea, "Dus volt," which means God wills it. That became the battle cry for all of the Crusades going forward. "Dus volt." So God wills it. Well, kind of aside, one of the questions on your sheet, was this a just war? So think about Augustine's just war theory. These are the principles or the guidelines for what establishes a just war. Is the war conducted or waged by a legitimate authority? Is it waged by the state, or is it waged by an individual? If it's a legitimate authority, then yes, that's one element. Is there a just cause? Are you engaging in war in defense or to vindicate some wrong? Is there a right intention? This idea is that you're not going into war for revenge or wrath, but it's to correct a wrong. It's almost a humility that, as a parent disciplines a child. You're trying to correct something. So it's the right intentions. And ultimately, the goal should be to establish peace. So the question is, if you look at those criteria for just war, do you think the Crusades met the criteria for a just war? No. They were very full of revenge and hatred towards the Muslims, and they ended up actually attacking Jews. So really the answer is it was not a just war.
But in their defense, they would say they lost. Jerusalem was the holy place for them.
Exactly. And yeah.
So if you take a, only award that really hasn't been a lot of it.
Sure.
All the rest of it, they kind of, because they just wanted to get back to Jerusalem. I mean, that's what they pitched.
And that was their premise.
The paper definitely leans towards a just war theory, and everybody bought into it for that.
Yeah. So he called for the recapture of and if that's where it was, say, hey, we're going to go and free Jerusalem. Then yeah, you could say,
I think
yeah,
that's the difference of what it was when it was called and what it became.
yeah. And I'm not sure that Pope Urban really made that. He put it in the right terms, but I'm not sure that he really had the right mindset
His heart
himself.
mindset was definitely not.
Right, right. I don't think it was. Yeah. So here's a summary of some of the Crusades. I'm not going to go through all 7 Crusades. This map just shows the first 7 or the first 4. And I'm just going to run through these very quickly because I'm running out of time. But the first Crusade was a major success in terms of a military success. It resulted in the recapture of Jerusalem in 1099 and established the Crusader states. The Crusader states are over here: Jerusalem, the county of Tripoli, Antioch, and Edessa. So those were established as a result of the first crusade. The second crusade was called by Pope Eugenius, or Eugenius, I'm not sure how you, but when the kingdom of Jerusalem faced its first crisis, it was teetering on the brink of destruction. They called for the second crusade. They attempted to capture the county of Edessa, but they failed. They made it to Edessa. They failed at Edessa. Damascus fell in defeat, and they retreated. The main thing that is notable about the Second Crusade is this is when some key groups that you probably heard of arose, such as the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, and the Hospitallers all emerged and were authorized by the Pope during this time frame to be warriors for the papacy. Let me go back over here. The Third Crusade. The Third Crusade may be one of the most colorful crusades. It involves people that you probably heard of. Richard the Lionhearted. This one was really kind of interesting, I think. They started out with 3 European leaders, Frederick of Barbarossa, Philip II of France, and Richard the Lionhearted of England. Frederick drowned. Philip and Richard quarreled, and Richard ended up taking his ball and going home. So it ended up being just Richard going on his way down. The king of Saladin at that time, his name was the king of Jerusalem. His name was Saladin. He was a interesting person. To bring the story to a close, he basically went to Richard and said, "Hey, you know what? We don't have to spill all this blood. Why don't you just marry my sister?" So Richard said, "Okay, I'll marry your sister." And Saladin gave him Palestine as a wedding present, and that was kind of their peace treaty. And that lasted for about 3 years. They had an agreement where they'd have unlimited access to Jerusalem for 3 years. So in that sense, the Third Crusade was kind of successful. They gave them access to Jerusalem, but they didn't really take it back and own Jerusalem. So they didn't free it altogether. Now the Fourth Crusade, this was one Innocent led or called for. It was a complete disaster. And if you come up here to Venice, what happened is the merchants in Venice made an agreement with the crusade leaders and said, you know what, we will build you a fleet of ships to take all of your crusaders and haul them across the sea. But there's going to be a charge for that, But what happened is the leaders greatly overestimated how many crusaders were going to be needed for these boats. So they overbuilt. They built a lot more boats than they needed. So when they called for the Crusades, very few people showed up, and the people of Venice are going, we built all these boats, guys, and we got to be paid for these boats. And the Crusaders said, well, we can't pay for the boats. So what was the solution? So the leaders of Venice said, I've got an idea. There's this town across the way over here, Zadar or Zara. It's a Christian community, but it was a competing port city for Venice. They said, you know what? If you'll go over there, if you sack that city and collect all the, take, all of the proceeds from that city, bring it back to us, we'll call it good. So the Crusaders did that. So they went and they sacked the Christian city of Zeta, and the Pope excommunicated the Crusaders for that. But then, after that, a second diversion, the Byzantine prince Alexios entered into an agreement with the Crusaders to divert to Constantinople. So you see the yellow line now goes to Constantinople, and he was saying that, okay, my father Isaac II had had been deposed, and if you go up there and you restore him to power, put him back on the seat of authority, then he will find favor with you, and he'll give you all kinds of riches and money. So they did that, and when they restored Isaac to power, Alexios was crowned co-emperor, and he lasted in that role for a few months. There was a popular uprising, they killed him, and then the Crusaders, then they didn't get what they were looking for, so they decided, well, we'll just sack all of Constantinople. So that crusade ended up sacking, a Christian city over here, and sacking Constantinople, and that's where it ended, basically. So it never made it to Jerusalem. It was a complete failure, and it was a major headache for Innocent III. And that's where I'm going to end discussion on it. If you want to talk about the 5th, 6th, and 7th Crusades, they were kind of interesting as well, but those are the main things I wanted to point out. But
So I thought that if you went on a crusade, you had all your sins forgiven. Is that before or after the excommunication?
well, he excommunicated them, so I guess their sins weren't forgiven. And so at that point, it's like, hey, you may as well just,
Do whatever we want.
do whatever we want. Exactly. Yeah. Okay, we have just a few minutes here. We want to talk about scholasticism. So I'm going to skip down here. The rise of the universities. In the 8th century, Charlemagne decreed that every monastery have a school to teach all who, with God's help, are able to learn. So historically, all of the learning took place in these cathedral schools or in the monasteries. It was historically religious education. It was historically designed for the laity, for the priests to learn, and studies in theology and so forth. But at some point, they decided, you know what, these guys need to start reading the original text. So they started introducing studies in Latin. And so it started becoming a little bit broader than just theology lessons. Well, Charlemagne came along and said the cathedral schools, or let's provide education, and the cathedral schools provided the best place for that. He initially said monasteries, but the cathedral schools were located in the communities where the people lived. So the cathedrals became schools that would teach the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So there were some really well-known teachers that emerged during this time frame. Gerbet, I'm going to say Gerbet because he's French, of Aurillac. He later became Pope Sylvester II, but he was one of the early teachers, and he had a lifelong love for learning. He started out at Saint Denis learning, and then he was such an impressive student that one of his mentors took him back to Spain, where he studied with the under the in one of the monasteries there. But he was greatly influenced by who? The Islam had been taken over in Spain, so he learned a lot from them as well. And he brought back to Europe the idea of the abacus and the amylary sphere. I don't know what the amylary sphere is. I tried to read about it, tried to understand it, still don't know anything about it. But it's impressive if you want to read about it. It's all math and science and everything. But he brought these tools back to Europe, and he became a teacher at Reims. And he was a teacher at Reims for many years. Students loved him. He eventually went on and became a tutor for one of the emperors in Rome, and was eventually, through a series of events, elevated to Pope. But he was one of the early scholars in this movement. The next one I want to talk about is Peter Abelard, who, interestingly, nobody knows what that name means. It was just a word, a name he picked up. He coined it himself. He was actually born Pierre Le Palais, was his real name. But he's the one who gave us the word theology. He coined that term for us. He also wrote a book called Si et Non, which is yes and no. This was a book that it was a series of questions where he took both sides of the issue and encouraged people to doubt, to ask questions, and things like that. He was a very colorful figure. He had a lot of interesting romance issues and things like that. He was always one step ahead of the clergy or the leadership of the church. He was, at one point, he was sequestered in a monastery, and being creative, he asked, "Can I just go out into the wilderness out here east of Paris and just have some quiet time?" They said, "Sure." Well, he'd go out there, and then all of his students would meet him, and they would cook for him and do things for him, and he would have his following out there in the wilderness in Paris. But that was the idea. That was really the beginnings of the idea of a university, because that's what the university was all about. It wasn't about the buildings and the classrooms and the quads and things like that. It was about a teacher who would meet with the students, and they would have a cohort, and they would follow each other. That's how the whole idea started. Now, Abelard was eventually not excommunicated, but he was his ideas were didn't compel or didn't sit well with leadership. So he was can't remember the word, but he was set aside. He was what? Dispatched. Yeah, and he actually died in exile. Yeah, so for his beliefs. Well, this whole idea, his beliefs were very radical. They were very influenced by Greek thought, where you question and you ask, you debate and things like that, which was not real comfortable to a lot of the European students. And the church leaders felt like he was asking too many questions or questioning things about the faith. Oh, I was getting ahead of myself. So during this time period, all this movement gave rise to many universities, starting in Paris, Orleans, Montpellier, Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna, and Padua. Bologna, the university established in Bologna, is still today the longest serving university in continuous operation. in the world. So kind of interesting. So in addition to lectures, the method of teaching was largely this method called disputation. The disputation is this idea of questioning and answering, basically a debate form, where the teachers would often stand and debate. Sometimes the students would participate, but it would be like a couple of us getting up here on Sunday morning, and instead of just lecturing, we would debate and what is true, what is not true, what's right, what's not right, and the students would learn from that and understand the distinctions and the different viewpoints. That was the idea of disputation. It created a very formalized method of debate. Strict rules were followed, and scholasticism developed in this context. Scholasticism is logical conclusions derived from painstaking questioning, examining, and arranging details. And this method really became the prominent method of universities into the 1700s. There are good and bad things of scholasticism. One of the good things is it gave us a structure for learning, but the teachers, they felt like human reason can explain and defend Christian doctrine, but there are some doctrines that just can't be explained. For example, one of the questions that Aquinas asked was, should God be figured out or should he be trusted? Are there things that we can actually, there are things that are mysterious to us. Are those there for us to figure out and explain, or are they there for us to have faith and trust God? And that's always kind of a tension when we're looking at education. Scholasticism treats divine mysteries as problems to be solved. We can debate it, we can solve it, we can figure this out. And that is probably the biggest complaint or downside, I guess, of scholasticism, is that it's the balance between faith and reason. The challenge is it risks making human logic the judge of revelation rather than the servant of revelation. So we are out of time. The last thing I was going to mention is Thomas Aquinas. I'm not going to spend any time here except that Thomas Aquinas was called in to respond to this. The church felt like these scholars were getting out of control with all their questions and things like that. And they asked Thomas Aquinas to come in and help bring this back into control. Thomas Aquinas wrote his magnum opus, which is Summa Theologica, to address a lot of these questions that were being posed in these cathedral schools at the time. So I think that's, since we're out of time, I'm not going to spend any more time talking about Thomas Aquinas, but I would encourage you to read a little bit about him. Very interesting. If you're not familiar with the Summa Theologica, read a summary of it. It's very interesting. The Summa Theologica, by the way, my understanding is it is still probably one of the primary texts used by the Roman Catholic Church. As far as it's still very revered. It's one of their doctrinal books. So, all right. Anything else? Well, thanks for keeping up with me. This is a lot to take in today. Scott, would you pray for us to wrap us up?
Lord, thank you for clarity in what has happened in the past and how that affects us today. And we ask that you would guide everyone teaching to continue the journey. And we ask that you would bless all of us during the coming week. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you, guys. Lunch at Chipotle. See you there.